Howdy, y'all. It's Juliet Necro. Valkyria Chronicles isn't happening. Instead, it's time to talk about Unsighted. Unsighted was developed by the Brazilian studio Pixelpunk and published by Humble Games last September. I bought it in December, right before my year-long moratorium on buying new games went into effect. After deciding that I didn't want to do Valkyria Chronicles for a video anymore, I decided to pick it up instead and see what it was about. Thinking it would be a fun little Zelda-like, I was instead greeted by one of the best indies I've played. This game's about trans robot lesbians, for Christ's sake. However, I don't want this video to be a general review. Instead, I want to put all the focus on one particular facet of Unsighted, the death countdown mechanic, and how it changes the player's relationship with the game. In the world of Unsighted, all of the NPCs and player characters are automatons. Automatons, in this setting, were once mindless servants for humans, until a meteor crashed into the city where the game takes place, and brought with it anima, a form of energy that gave the automatons sentience. After a war between automatons and humans, the humans placed a huge tower over the meteor, preventing the anima from radiating out. This means that every character in Unsighted, including the player character, has a limited amount of in-game time until they lose their consciousness and go unsighted. When this happens, they essentially become zombies who attack other automatons on sight in order to obtain the anima within them. Once the player learns that this mechanic exists, you gain the ability to see how much time every character, including your player character, has until they go unsighted. This has the effect of increasing the urgency of the game greatly. The player character Alma's remaining hours are displayed every time you enter a new screen and every time you die. It was genuinely nail-biting seeing myself losing hours from repeat attempts at some of the game's bosses. I struggled with a lot of the bosses on my first playthrough, and this was an added stressor on top of that. Alma starts the game with about 325 hours remaining, and I finished the game with around 130 remaining. The constant reminders of the player's remaining time reminded me of Pikmin. For those of you who haven't played Pikmin, in that game the player has crashed on a planet with a hostile environment, with only about 30 days worth of life support left. It puts pressure on the player to repair their spaceship and escape the planet. Pikmin is very beatable within the time frame allotted, but it does a lot to change the feel of the game and give it some more urgency. I think it's a big part of the reason that I finished Pikmin 1 but never felt as motivated to finish Pikmin 2, which has no sort of time limit. I would later discover that the developers have in fact cited Pikmin as an inspiration for the game, alongside other such disparate influences as the Souls series, Gears of War, and the catalog of Supergiant games. Unsighted lit a similar fire under my butt to the first Pikmin. I wound up finishing my first playthrough in a matter of 3 days over a few long play sessions, largely because of my motivation to not let Alma run out of time before I could finish the game. It was a great form of motivation to learn from mistakes. When you have a limited amount of time till game over, you make each life count. This game will absolutely whip your ass if you just try to mash, and I learned that the hard way. This game also has Zelda-esque dungeons and puzzles, and here too the time limit on the player caused me some stress. I am pretty good at learning video game combat and winning at mechanical challenges, but I am infamously terrible at solving video game puzzles. I have a tendency to try and overcomplicate them to the point of incredulity, but again, the time limit on Alma, although it's pretty lenient, still led me to actually tighten up my thinking cap and learn the game's puzzle logic. It really helps that this game's puzzles and dungeons are excellently and naturalistically designed to have a flow and structure to them. I feel I would have been more likely to call the time limit unfair if the dungeons weren't well designed enough that the onus was on me. Instead, this is pitched at just the right level. Side note, I think that more games should have difficulty settings for puzzles in addition to combat, although that's probably more work to implement than traditional difficulty settings. I just want more games to accommodate people like me who can beat Doom Eternal on Nightmare, but get stumped by elementary school logic puzzles. More interesting than the effect of the time limit on Alma herself is the effect it has on your NPC allies. Every NPC in the game, as I said, has a limited amount of time until they go unsighted, and you lose the use of them for the rest of the game. Even the dude who gives you a fishing rod can go unsighted. Many of the NPCs, such as Drillo, the aforementioned fishing guy, and the traveling merchant, have designs that have either already shown up or will show up later in the game as enemies. I think this was a fantastic design decision, as it helps sell the tragedy of going unsighted. Each of the enemies that you have to mow down in order to save the remaining NPCs was once a consciousness just like the ones that are left. It's too late for them now. It leaves the player to wonder what they were like in life, before they went unsighted. What did they see? What moments did they have in their life? Who did they love and who loved them? Now all of that is lost, like tears in rain. I do think that the Blade Runner comparison is apt, not just because of the cyberpunk setting, but because it similarly sells how much of a tragedy an individual death is. We often think about death in the context of missing the dead person. We struggle to think about what our lives will be like without them. We cry because we'll never see them again. That's all natural, of course, but less common is the work of fiction that engages with the idea that death is tragic even without the context of others to mourn the dead. The loss of a consciousness and the experiences it has is inherently a tragedy, and this game really sells that. It has a lot of really genuinely lovable NPCs, and knowing that they have a countdown till they run out of time is yet more motivation to quickly resolve the situation with the Crater Tower. The time limit also gives tension to going for optional content before finishing the game. When you forge the Meteor Blade, the weapon that grants access to the Crater Tower, and therefore the end game, you gain the ability to fight the shadow monsters that appear at various places in Arcadia. When you kill one, it increases the attack power of your endgame weapon. When you forge the weapon, Olga will mark the location of all the shadow monsters on your map, so that you can power up your weapon before the endgame. But again, that time limit introduces some tension. You likely are starting to run short on time here, especially in a first playthrough, and there are probably at least a couple of characters that are close to going unsighted. So the question becomes, do you risk letting that happen and spend some time leveling up your gear before heading into the tower, or potentially give yourself a harder time inside in exchange for more time wiggle room? The lives of your friends hang in the balance after all. However, there is one thing you can do to extend the lives of characters, and that's to give them meteor dust. Meteor dust can be found in chests throughout the game world, often off the beaten path and requiring some puzzle-solving skills to obtain, or at least going a bit out of your way. When you give meteor dust to an automaton, it extends their remaining time by 24 hours and increases their relationship with you. When a character's relationship is maxed out, they often give a reward of some kind, which can be absolute game changers. For example, maxing out your relationship with Samuel the chip salesman allows you to swap out your equipped chips anywhere rather than just at a terminal, which is incredibly helpful. Anna the shopkeep gives you a chip that increases your maximum health by a whopping 5 hearts. Elissa, who's doing research on extending automaton life, can actually give you extra permanent healing syringes in exchange for 3 dust each, which is pretty steep. Essentially, each one of those represents a character whose relationship can't be maxed out, at least based on how much dust there seems to be in the game. There's a huge opportunity cost to giving dust, as you might regret your choice. There's an extra challenge involved here, as characters' likability has little to do with how useful their upgrade is. Elissa, as previously stated, was actually exiled from the village for her unethical experiments, but gives one of the most useful rewards in the game. It actually raises the question of who's more worthy of dust and makes having a limited supply of it hurt all the more. I actually maxed my relationship with Ivana during my first playthrough, just because I liked her. I found out that she gives you one of the worst rewards, a mid-tier gun. It creates an interesting tension between wanting to give characters dust because you like them, or doing so for their reward. In another interesting twist, almost every character in Gear Village already knows Alma in some capacity, so their relationship with her is deeper than they necessarily are with the player. Anna the shopkeep is an old friend who has an unrequited crush on Alma. Samuel the chip salesman also claims that he and Alma are old friends. Cecilia, who runs the training dojo, trained Raquel to fight, who in turn trained Alma. The fact that Alma already knows most of the major NPCs in some capacity makes Gear Village feel a lot more like a real community than most video game towns I've encountered. Alma certainly feels like a member of the community much more than other video game protagonists with their starting towns. Other NPCs that don't live in Gear Village also have connections to one another, which makes the whole game world feel interconnected. The whole reason Iris met Alma was that she was out searching for her sister, Crystal, who you discover hints about throughout the game. Eventually, you find the lab where Iris and Crystal were created, but find that Crystal has already gone unsighted. I was later relieved to discover that it's impossible to save Crystal, according to a developer interview. Nevertheless, it was a surprising amount of depth to give to this game's equivalent to Navi the Fairy, and many other NPCs are like that too. It's a great incentive to keep the NPCs alive and to treat them as valuable. It made a mistake that I made in my first playthrough hurt all the worse. While I was grinding on one of the boss fights, I started to get spooked by my remaining time and impulsively used a meteor dust on Alma herself, and almost immediately regretted it. Alma has one of the highest remaining times of any character in the game, and I knew almost immediately that I had wasted a dust. I finished the game with time to spare for her, and instead let a couple of different characters go unsighted. The one that hurt the most in my case was Iris, the fairy that follows Alma on her journey. She's a kind presence and the only constant companion you have. She marks important locations on your map and gives some actually useful tips. I didn't even notice how little time she starts with until I first noticed that it had dipped into a 2-digit number. Unsighted doesn't give you any notifications that a character is about to go unsighted until they only have 24 hours left. It has a habit of sneaking up on you if you aren't paying attention consistently. In Iris's case, however, she has the advantage, or perhaps disadvantage, of being around Alma all the time. I was in the last dungeon, the factory, when Iris stopped me. The music even cut out suddenly. She had about 13 hours left until she went unsighted. Iris, being the only character that's with Alma the entire time, is the only one who can directly ask her for meteor dust. She tells Alma that she can feel her consciousness slipping. Needless to say, I was a bit spooked by this and gave her the dust right away. However, later on in the game, when I was making preparations to enter the crater tower, I realized that Iris's timer had slipped my mind, and she left my company so that I wouldn't have to see her go unsighted. When you lose Iris, you lose the ability to change out your chip loadout. Obviously, this was irritating, but losing Iris made me genuinely sad. I missed her in the endgame. The other characters to go unsighted in my first run were Cecilia, BB-42, who upgrades your weapons, and Cleo, the fishing automaton. I felt even worse for Cecilia, because I never even entered the dojo until right before I went to go fight the final boss, so she entered my world with only 13 hours left to live. I got the notification that she had gone unsighted right before facing off with the final boss. All of this just gives me extra motivation to go back through another time and kick the game's ass. I definitely think that in a second run I'll be able to save everyone, and in future runs I'll be able to do so in style. The fact that this game grades you on several performance metrics and features a new game plus suggested to me that this was the developer's intent when creating this game. Hello again. I am now reporting back after having finished a new game plus round of Unsighted. Everything I wrote up to this point, barring some edits, was written after I finished my first playthrough. And I decided to structure this video around different playthroughs. If you'll pardon the expression, the New Game Plus playthrough is a game changer. For starters, this is a very open New Game Plus. The only item that doesn't carry over between the initial playthrough and New Game Plus is the Meteor Blade that would allow you to skip straight to the endgame. Everything else, including all the items you find that help progress in dungeons, is retained, meaning that you can open basically all the chests in the game world right off the bat. This means that you're likely to be absolutely swimming in meteor dust on a subsequent playthrough, able to provide it much more freely to your allies, and better able to keep everyone alive. Having upgrades like the double hookshot, yes, this game brought back the best Zelda item ever and it rocks, and the spinner makes the dungeons go away quicker. There are entire bosses that can be skipped in New Game Plus, since you already have the upgrades that you earn from them. In addition, my greater familiarity with the combat and puzzles helped a lot in making my second playthrough go a lot faster. I only died once in my entire New Game Plus playthrough, and got past all the bosses with practically no issues. I've actually forgotten when that solitary death actually occurred, but I remember the circumstances being kind of silly. I had a temporary syringe that I wound up holding onto for the entire playthrough, never having needed it. I also practically sped through the game. Most of the third dungeon, the aquarium, is skippable in New Game Plus, if you remember the solution to the final puzzle, which in your first playthrough required a bit of a wild goose chase. When I finished the New Game Plus, Alma had about 250 hours left. I finished the game about twice as quickly as I did in the initial run, and this time every character survived. That had been my goal for the second playthrough, which you're seeing footage from now, and I succeeded. It's very, very rare for me to play a game twice through right away like that, but something about this game's time limit and the desire to optimize led to me jumping right back in. Since everyone lived, I actually noticed differences in the ending. Since BB-42 survived, I got a message saying he was restoring the highways instead of just being told that the highways were restored. Similarly, I read about Cleo's role in the restoration of sea life at the aquarium instead of just being told that the sea life had returned. Most significant to me, though, was what a difference having Iris around for the endgame made in comparison to her absence at the end of the first playthrough. When entering the crater tower, she and Alma shared a moment where they thanked each other for their company. I missed out on that scene in my first playthrough. Even though Iris doesn't really say much for the rest of the endgame, having her around changed the vibe a whole lot, for the better. It just felt less lonely making my way through the tower when I had her with me. She even had some words to say in the ending that made me very happy. I was legitimately touched by getting to hear her words in the ending after having lost her in my first playthrough. It's stuff like that that makes the time limit for NPCs such an interesting mechanic. After having these characters be absent, their presence is felt all the more. For my next experiment, I want to try again from the beginning, without New Game Plus this time, and see if I can keep everyone alive based solely on game knowledge, without the benefit of all the extra items. It is a testament to how compelled I am by this mechanic that I'm about to go for a third run in a row. The next sentence I say will pick up after the third playthrough. I'm not sure if I've ever enjoyed a replay of a game as much as I enjoy replaying Unsighted from scratch for my third playthrough. Normally, replaying single-player games can be a bit of a chore for me, unless I really love them, because I have such a good memory for games that playing again barely feels different. I remember games so well that replaying feels like going through the motions. Most of the time, I try to wait more than a year between playing the same game twice, because otherwise it feels like I'm not getting anything out of it. However, Unsighted has the death counters that make a huge difference. Since I had the additional goal of preventing any of the NPCs from going unsighted on a clean file, it gave a lot more context to a from-scratch repeat playthrough and made it really enjoyable. Rather than my excellent memory for games being a hindrance to my enjoyment, it enhanced this run as it made going for my goal manageable and fun. I made some more discoveries as well, such as realizing you have the wall jump ability as soon as you obtain the high jump boots early on. In my first run, I didn't realize wall jumping was possible until the game taught me to do it in the lead up to the 5th dungeon, the factory. But now that I knew that it was possible, I was able to skip most of the preamble to the factory and essentially walk straight from the end of the 4th dungeon to the beginning of the 5th. That's just one example of how repeat playthroughs of this game make it so enjoyable. Obviously, many games track things like items found, secrets discovered, completion time, and total deaths as metrics for potential replays, but the character timers just feel more visceral. The story plays out the same in Super Metroid, for example, if you take 10 hours to finish the game and only collect the bare minimum items, versus collecting everything in under 3 hours, aside from how naked Samus gets on the ending screen. On the other hand, the timer Unsighted places on the different characters is much more visceral as an incentive to perfection. I felt more motivated than I ever have before to replay the game again and get it totally right this time. And you know what? I succeeded. I started from a fresh file and managed to use my knowledge and skill to save everyone this time. It was great fun to see how different my third run and second fresh run was from my first. In my first run, I died 48 times and took over 5 hours to finish the game. And in my second new game run, I took about 3 hours and died only 4 times. All of my 4 deaths were early on in the run. This time I decided to try using axes instead of swords as my primary weapon, so I attribute those early deaths to learning the ropes of a new weapon type. I found more of the chests in this run than I did in previous runs as well. I went more out of my way to find meteor dust than I did in the first run, in order to ensure the survival of all the NPCs. In the end, I wound up with way more meteor dust than I needed to save everyone. It really made me feel powerful, as it demonstrated how far I'd come since the first run just a few days before. This game is made for people like me, who have excellent memories for games, who thrive in a familiar environment. The first run was fun, but the addition of the extra goal on top of the base game made it even more enjoyable. This is definitely the most emotionally invested I've ever been in a replay of a previously finished game. I felt almost guilted into trying again from scratch after failing to save everyone on the first run, but not in a manipulative way, in a self-motivating way. Being able to keep all of this lovely cast of characters alive is a wonderful feeling. However, in my research on the game between runs, I've discovered that this game has some secret bosses and a true ending. I'm going to do one more run, another New Game Plus run, where I fight these bosses and find the true ending, to see how it changes the experience one more time. Also, maybe in this run I'll finally remember the damn password in the Highways dungeon, instead of forgetting like I've done in every other run. Oops. I will see you after one more run. Catch you then. Okay, update for run number 4. I did in fact remember the password in the Highways dungeon, allowing me to skip a lot of it. That's beside the point though. I absolutely love the additional bosses and extra content. It's definitely stuff that one is expected to discover on subsequent playthroughs, and I thought it was really cool. Step 1 to achieving the true ending is to go to the cathedral in the central area and pay 1,000 bolts to enter. Inside, you meet an automaton called M, who offers to take the life of an NPC to give their anima to Alma. Obviously, this is pretty immoral. If you choose M herself from the list twice, Alma would tell her off for viewing some lives as expendable instead of valuable, and a boss fight is initiated. Unfortunately, I found the boss fight against M way too easy, although that may have been because I waited until the end game, when I had the corrupted axe, to challenge her. Anyway, after defeating her, Alma still refuses to kill her, but M disappears anyway. Importantly though, when you defeat M, you find a key card that can be used to enter an otherwise impossible to access area in the crater tower. Here you can find some science logs about M's origins, and you also find a blueprint for a clock that requires several items that are unique and exceptionally well hidden across the game world. They require checking every nook and cranny of the game world and completing some combat challenges to obtain. I feel that I did myself a slight disservice by using a guide to complete this playthrough, as going in blind would have made me feel some of the tension of the time limits again. But there's no use being upset about it now. What's done is done. 3 of the hidden clock pieces are in previously explored areas, but hidden very well. The 4th requires traversing the crypt, a mini-dungeon that I never found in my first 3 playthroughs. After fighting another extra boss, a giant enemy crab, the last clock piece was in my hand. Side note, that crab boss was an absolute bastard. He has so much health and requires concentration for so long at a time. He also essentially can't be damaged without getting a lot of perfect parries on him. It took me longer than anything else on the playthrough, and I think it was the first boss I've died to since the initial run. But anyway, after defeating him, the last clock piece was in my hand, and I was able to craft the ancient clock. Elsewhere in the crypt mini-dungeon, there is a frame for a grandfather clock with all of the guts missing, so naturally I took the ancient clock there and installed it. When you install the ancient clock in the crypt, a final secret is revealed. A time portal that when traversed will lead you back to the beginning of day 1, just after the opening. You're back in Gear Village at the beginning of the first day, but retaining everything you've done up to this point. Entering the crypt dungeon requires having obtained the meteor blade, so you now have the ability to head straight to the final boss and finish the game on day 1. When you do, the final boss reveals that it can tell you've traveled through time and reveals a surprise third form, but luckily it's not too tough. Thus, you can truly save everyone with time to spare. I love this ending, and find it really thematically resonant. For starters, tying M into this plotline is really clever. In order to access the path to the secret ending, the player has to prove that they're selfless by refusing M's offer to extend their time at the expense of the NPCs. And in fact, they have to throw the offer back in M's face. In a sense, you have to prove that you've come to see the game's characters' lives as valuable. It's essentially a final exam where the game says, "Did you understand what we were trying to say with this piece?" That's a bit of hyperbole, but I hope you'll permit me. Once you've passed the M fight, the final mechanical exam of the game, in my view, is the crab boss fight in the crypt, which I found way more challenging than the extra phase of the final boss fight. I had to get very good at parries to get past him and the stupid enemies he spawns, but I succeeded there too. And of course, lastly is the exploration to find the remaining clock pieces. In a way, achieving the true ending and saving everyone requires engaging with the game one last time in each of the ways that matters: dialogue, combat, and exploration. It's the kind of ending that players are only likely to find on a subsequent run, and I doubt I would have gone for it without the motivating factor of the timed element to this game. It was the timer that motivated me to put a lot of time into learning the game during the first run. It was the timer that motivated me to try New Game Plus right afterwards, and it was the timer that spurred on the last 2 runs as well. Very rarely have I felt so motivated and so rewarded by multiple subsequent playthroughs of the same game, and for that I'm very grateful. This game has easily become one of my favorites that I've played this year, and I definitely see myself coming back to it even more times in the future, possibly to try and go for 100% completion of the achievements. However, I recognize that the element of a time limit is not enjoyable to everyone the same way it is to me. While I find challenges like that to be motivating, I definitely recognize how they could be demoralizing or stress-inducing to other players. For that reason, I'm glad that this game gives the player the option to turn off the time limits when the mechanic is first introduced. There is a lot to love about this game's story and characters, and I think it would be a shame for someone to have to miss out on that because they've been put off by the time limit mechanic. This game's story is still engaging, its characters still masterfully written, and its combat is still very fun, with or without the time limit, so the option to remove it is a positive move in allowing more people to enjoy the game in a way that works for them. If you're a certain type of person, you might have the impulse to say that playing without the time limits doesn't count, or isn't a real playthrough of the game for whatever reason. I myself used to be that person, not with this game but with others, unfortunately. But really, what do you gain from trying to diminish the fun someone else is having with the game that they paid for just like you did? Single-player games are inherently not a competition between players, so someone playing in a different way than you presents no threat whatsoever. All you're doing is stroking your own ego, and no one is really that impressed by it. I made this video focusing on Unsighted's time limits because the mechanic added a lot of texture and flavor to my subjective experience, and that's what I want to document. If other people have a different subjective experience, they should be accommodated too, because ultimately, Unsighted rules, and everyone should get to experience it in a way that's best for them. Thanks for watching. Links to my Twitter and my anime podcast will be in the description. Till next time, ciao!